Hello everyone, thank you for coming down. We're a little bit blinded by time here, but just for the moment until the screening starts. So I just wanted to give you a little bit of an overview of what's happening this evening. First of all, we're going to be watching When I'm With You, which is Katharine's stop motion animation, which is an hour long. So we'll watch that first. We'll then have a Q&A both about that and some of the themes that come up more generally that connect with the new work. So we'll be talking, but also do feel free to ask questions as well. So there will be sort of time for conversation between all of us. Then Katharine's going to present her new work, The Fur Chest, and we'll talk again through that. Then any last burning questions, and then we'll be heading back downstairs for wine and snacks and more conversation.
And you can see the portfolio of
yes.
research images if you haven't seen it yet. Great.
Obviously, yeah, we're starting with the film, but just to give a little bit of an introduction to some of the themes that we'll be exploring this evening. Obviously, the idea of domesticity is pretty central to both of the works that we're going to be looking at. So it's very nice that we're in this space. I think there's quite a lot of the kind of vibe of Katharine's work going on here. And we'll also be talking quite a lot about psychological space as well, and how kind of the psychological is shown through the domestic spaces. And something which I really enjoy, just in terms of the domestic in Katharine's work, is that it often explores women kind of on their own in these spaces. So I think often when we think of domesticity and art that kind of tackles domesticity, it often looks at women being kind of hemmed in by family and by men, whereas this is very much kind of women in their space exploring their minds. So I think that's something really lovely about it as well. So we'll start the screening and then we'll have some time for some questions.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing the film with us. It was really good to see it on the big screen. I watched it on my laptop to begin with, so sort of seeing it at that domestic scale was amazing. I mean, to begin with, it would be great to talk a little bit about the process of making it. And I know that part of it was written when you were in your own slightly strange state of isolation. So it'd be good to hear a little bit about that, and I suppose how your own psychology fell into it as well.
Yeah, sure. And also, can everyone hear me okay? I'm aware I'm feeling a bit coldy and quiet.
You're fine.
So shout if you can't. So the genesis of this project was quite a strange week in summer of 2021. I was at home in quarantine. I spent a week with Danielle, and then I was about to go on somewhere else. And in that week, everything in my life came back as a no. Like no fellowship, no film commission, no other fund, and some personal no's. And I couldn't leave the house. So I was feeling a bit sorry for myself. And actually, Margie, who's in the room, had introduced me, hello Margie, to this amazing children's storybook called The Lonely Doll by, is it Dare Wright? Yeah, something like that. My coldy brain is anyway, and it's this sort of black and white photo book, and I mean that's its own world of strangeness and spanking and other things. But anyway, I wrote this quite sorry for myself monologue under the title The Lonely Doll, and had this idea that the film was going to start sort of with a doll in that house and me in my house, and some sort of like play between scales, or like some sort of relational thing happening. And then so I had, and some of you will have seen it the year before, so no, that year, mere months before, because I make a film a year it seems, mere months before I'd made my first stop motion in that doll's house with was one doll, and you know, she's a sort of in-head monologue protagonist lead. So I had that kind of method down. That was a stop motion I made during lockdown, that much more dealt with the house as a body and as a sort of, like a psychic refuge refuge from illness. Anyway, so I started, so I was like, well, it can't be the same doll. She's had her moment. I need a new doll. So I started auditioning a doll, and that means looking online for a doll to buy. And I found this doll that was already named Margot. So that first doll, her official name in the world is Margot. And it instantly brought to mind, like, sort of, I don't know, well, a kind of like sort of Lynchian vibes to me for sure, and kind of like Margot from The Good Life. And then I had the first line, like, Margot's been waiting in her house for 40 years, sort of just fell. And then, let's not pretend these things are linear, and also, like, stop me at any point, because it's quite, it's a long story of stops and starts. I had Margot and some time to feel sorry for myself and to do some reading, because I just, sort of shot and made a film, and I wasn't quite ready to do, like, real work, so I'm just going to read some books. And I put off reading Susie Orbach's Bodies. Like, I'd started it and I'd found it, like, quite hard going, and I was like, maybe I'll wait till I'm in a different mood. So I got that out, and she's sort of talking about, this kind of idea of, she's focusing more on women's bodies and the kind of the social formation of women's bodies, but, bodies in general. And through her I read Winnicott's idea of the true and the false self. So it kind of like potted idea of this as like, as an infant you're dependent on your primary caregiver. If your primary caregiver is mostly attuned to you and your needs, great. You'll have your sort of true sense of self will flourish. But if you have a primary caregiver who's mostly misattuned, you can kind of enter a state where you sort of empty out your true needs and desires and become a sort of reflection of what you think they want to see at the moment that they want to see it, because you're more likely to survive. And so you can sort of end up with an overdeveloped false self and an underdeveloped true self, and that's where this kind of idea of two bodies, or like a rigid and a floppy body, came from. And I hadn't for a while decided if like the rigid body was this kind of, strong sense of self, kind of like armor of self-knowing, and the floppy one was one that was sort of malleable, people-pleasing, or if it would be the other way around, the rigid body was one that was not truly formed and that could kind of snap like a mold, and the floppy one could be the one that moves with ease. But anyway, I had these like two bodies, and then I carried on reading, and should we do Marjorie or Mother Flower next? Let's do Marjorie. So I love reading the Guardian problem pages. I read all the Guardian problem pages, and I really love the below the line comments. I mean, that's where the juice is. And there was someone had written in, it was like quite, an upsetting one. It was a mother had written in with her 8 or 9 year old son, and he tried to strangle his best friend, and his best friend had forgiven him, but he couldn't forgive himself, and he couldn't kind of understand where this kind of like bad part had come from. So lots of people below the line were writing back about sort of, how they deal with like the shadow aspects of themselves, including, this isn't something that I was thinking about for the film, but I'll share it anyway. Someone who's like, yeah, my 2 children say they have someone who speaks to them in the mirror to tell them to do bad things. I'm like, store that for a rainy day. But then someone else was writing about his work colleague, and she'd said years ago she'd made a kind of separate persona called Marjorie, who was responsible for all the bad things, and Marjorie's also my grandmother's name, and also etymologically kind of linked to Margot.
Yeah.
So I was like, great, Marjorie. And then more reading. I left my cheat sheet at home and I can never remember this name, so maybe you'll know who this is, or if anyone wants to pitch in. So there were a surrealist couple, British surrealists, Grace Palethorpe and Reuben Medcanoff.
Yeah, we'll take a word.
We'll fluff that. Reuben something complicated beginning with an M. And he was a painter and she was an analyst. She's quite a lot older than him, maybe 25 years older. And they formed a relationship, and then they sort of brought their practices together and would swap. So one would paint and one would analyze. And they were married. They lived as a couple for a very long time, and then they got divorced so that she could formally adopt him. And then he named her Mother Flower. I just sometimes think, research is a fun and wild thing. I could keep talking all weekend. There were some bits, right? There were some bits, and then I started. Also in another reference, I don't know if anyone else is a sort of British child of the 80s, and I didn't grow up in the UK, but there was a show called Totty. It was a little stop motion animation set in a doll's house, and it was the first children's program ever to feature a murder. And I saw that when I was 3 or 4 years old, so I had that as kind of something resonant to look at. And I watched it again to be like, well, how do dolls talk to each other? And I don't know, maybe
I think that idea of
I'll stop.
almost kind of not knowing if feelings are yours or come from someone else is very present in those. And I think even in the fact as the viewer, you're not really sure if you're watching one person or a lot of people. And when we were talking, it also made me think of the kind of Freudian idea of the superego as well, which is often the damning voice in your mind, which he thought came from your parents. So even if you have lovely parents, you still only pick up on the damning parts in your superego. But again, it's that kind of difficulty in really separating out kind of what's me and what's not me, which I think also then connects with how you look at the body, where there's this idea of kind of what is my body, and am I my body? Is my body a door? So it'd be great to hear a little bit about that kind of connection between the mind and body in your work, and the blurring of those two as well.
Sure, yeah. I mean, I also I have a couple of strong yoga practices, and I'm always a bit mystified why they say the body, the belly, it's kind of, I find it strangely detached, but then, and I think, I'm going to speak from my perspective, my embodied perspective, but I think particularly women, I think men have caught up, I think other bodies have caught up, but I think, women have been kind of encouraged to think of themselves from the outside as parts and fragments. In terms of, I guess, mind and body, I don't necessarily think of them as split. I think, there's to me there's a constant kind of, anxiety or tension or confusion around agency and identity in my work. But I think, it seems every part of finding an autonomous, sort of recognizable to self is kind of about where your body meets the world and how your body meets the world and how you sort of inhabit a body that's meeting the world.
Yeah, and I think, as I mentioned at the start, I really like that you are exploring kind of women in domestic spaces. And I don't know, maybe this is just how I see it. I feel like she is totally on her own for the entire film. You have the kind of man made out of crockery and the baby piles, but it feels like it's all, she almost is in ownership of that space and of that fantasy and of those kind of semi-people that come and go throughout. And I wondered if that is something that you thought about sort of before making it, that you wanted to show the woman sort of in, not necessarily ownership of the space because it feels chaotic, but it's her alone. It's not kind of her in service to anything.
That's a great question. So I mean, I think Plate Man, as he's known.
I love Plate. I mean, I don't. He's quite right.
Yeah.
I wanted to laugh every time he came on.
So Plate Man, sitting on the toilet, not doing very much. I think Plate Man is the sort of the easiest one to read as a construct. I mean, he doesn't even really have a body, you know, and he gets dismembered and put back in the cupboard. You know, and the kind of, yeah, exactly, the intro, you know, starts with this kind of, you know, massive ambiguity around, like, if anybody ever joined this person in this house, or I would also even argue, is that person even in that house? But I think it's a really interesting question, because actually there was a moment where I'm like, I kind of have two leads, so it could be interesting to see for who else whose story was dominant, because we do kind of start with Margot, and then, you know, Mari, her daughter, is forever sort of falling around, playing catch up, trying to sort of, you know, everything is like her sticking in some spot, in some awkward position to try to be like, I mean, you know, if this were like slightly less controlled gore, she'd just be like this sort of drenched body. Again, and if you actually think those scenes are really happening or not. But then, I'm rambling a bit, but then we do kind of like end with, you know, with Mari being the one who sort of ultimately explodes out of the condition of even having a body into a kind of ecstasy.
Yeah. And before we open up to a couple of questions, I just had one more about the process of making the work, and I think people often look on stop motion in the same way as kind of hand-drawn animation as just being quite an intense and terrifying process, which I think does actually mirror some of the sorts of intensity and claustrophobia of the film as well. And I wonder what that process was like for you, and if that is something that you're carrying on into other works that don't utilise it as well.
Yeah, so, and as I said, like the genesis of this project was everyone in the whole world saying no to me at once. But then like 2 months later, the Barbican called and said, oh, hey, are you working on something? So I was like, oh, well, like, you know. I think at that point I literally had 4 character names. And I essentially had a screening date from them. That was the 25th of May. And I spent sort of this few months, you know, like writing, but my writing process is me kind of writing bits out of books that like kind of resonate with me. Then I'll like, oh, I'll kind of come back to that. So like Simone de Beauvoir's The Inseparables came out at that time. I wanted to look at like a really intense friendship dynamic for Margot and Marjorie, and I really wanted to look at Belma's writing on the doll and take it away from feeling uncomfortable about his kind of strange sort of mutilated multi-joint dolls, and try to write from the perspective of those dolls. So I had these notes, and at the same time as these notes, you know, I'd read something and kind of daydream and be like, I think Margot's going to stage her own death. Write that down, and then I'm like, I think, you know, Marie's going to try to discover her limits and like roll around in some ribbons. So I had literally like, I think there's, I don't know, maybe 50 scenes in this film. So I had, you know, 1 to 50, some numbers. So from the 3rd of Jan to the end of Feb, I shot a scene a day in my studio. And in terms of stop motion, I definitely say what I do is the smash and grab of stop motion. No training in animation. You know, like I would knock the doll, I would knock the camera, I would knock the light.
I mean, the pills look tedious. I was like, is she going through all of these? Wow.
Yeah, and actually there was one scene, the one with the sequins, I actually deleted it the first time. I wiped the memory card, and I was like, I'm definitely like, the dolls didn't rehearse much. They just kind of like got in there and did it, minimal briefing. So I shot a scene a day for 2 months, edited for 2 months, and because like some of it actually the bits that were live action. So any like camera movement is post-production, which is both fun and opens up an endless sea of possibilities. So that would take a little while. So I think edited for 2 months, and then the Barbican were getting a bit like, when can we see something? And I'm like, when's the screening date? Then. But I had the last month, I worked with a composer for the first time. Ned, who couldn't be here tonight, came with his keyboard and saxophone and a drum, and we sat in front of the video, and anything that sounds like someone who really can't play music is me, and anything that sounds like someone who understands what a chord is and more is him. And then I did the Foley, and then I kind of just sat with a microphone between my legs and wrote the script, watching the film, and recorded it into the edit.
And with the sound, some of those kind of bodily noises are so incredible.
They're great.
Sort of squelchy. Yeah, I thought that was really amazing.
I spent a lot of time listening to squishy noises.
Should we open up for a couple of questions? Yes.
There's so much to talk about, but the thing that impressed me most, and I want to ask you about this part, is about language and musicality, or maybe voice and music, because it sounds like singing. That I know it's poetry, but it's singing as well, like you could musically notate it. And it has sort of a structural function. I see it as sort of shaping it, stitching it together or not, but also adding so much to the visual side of it. And we mentioned it in proper music, which I think, talking about the counterpoint, there's some layers, and I think that the played music is like the bottom one, but there's this singing quality, this legato line of the singing voice, and so many percussive sounds, like the teeth and the beats, and even the baby's crying, there's some sort, and of course at the end, that thing. So, and this has this attachment and detachment and confuses things. So, of course, sometimes the voice is like, head body is linked but is detached, and it interacts with things. So about this generative side of the music, and I found you said you started with a monologue, and that sort of, it was something that I sort of could sense, and now you mentioned that the music really was at the end. So I know it's a complicated thing, the process, but how did you, because it feels like composed, like when you see it from beginning to end. And you can imagine the silent movie working, or someone just reciting the narrative, but this other layer, I think, really lifts it so much, and it's really impressive, and I would like to know more about how you...
So how I approach the writing. I mean, you're not wrong in that actually the first bit where the quotes the social, which is like the doll and the rabbit and the chattering teeth, are saying to Margot something like, it's in your shabby shoes, it's in your lumpen skirt. Like I had a Bowie song in my head, Valentine's Day, from the Next Day album, and I liked its kind of like... So I was thinking about that for the scan of that. Marjorie's dream life, I had Where Do You Go to My Lovely in my head. And I had to actually be, there's probably some takes where I'm literally singing her dream life to that rhythm, and I had to sort of try to take it back from being too musical. But I think, I mean, when I'm working in my studio, I'm listening to music non-stop, like Meatloaf died in one of those weeks, and like I had that out of hell on repeat. Oh, well, generally, for the, like, I filmed all, I call them the kind of like intercuts, all the, like her body, the body. I filmed them all in the same day. So there's a lot of meatloaf on the raw footage, that one, and me singing to meatloaf. But yeah, I think you're probably right in finding these rhythms and the kind of actually, I think my brother came and told me that I actually ripped off Darren Aronofsky without realizing it. We were talking about Requiem for a Dream, which I think neither of us have ever fully made it through a second viewing, because the first one was already so like, and then he's like, but and I was like, it already ends there. He's like, no, you've forgotten this other bit if you haven't. Anyway, we won't talk about disturbing things. But the bit where she's in the kind of yellow wallpaper of pills, and I'm kind of like, be the juice, eat the juice, love the juice, feel the sun, it's kind of like game showy, like whatever the show is in that. So yeah, there are moments where I'm thinking of like rhythms or mantras, sometimes connected to something, and other times, maybe they still are connected to something and I just haven't noticed it.
Yeah.
You talked about casting dolls.
Yeah.
And I'm very interested to know who got rejected. What time who's waiting in the wings?
Dear. Well, actually, and I should reference my doll maker, because the three of the dolls have two bodies. Marjorie, Margot, and Mari all have two bodies. One is a shop-bought body, and one was handmade for me by a doll maker called Anne. And I sent her my previous doll film, so she kind of knew the score, but I didn't necessarily tell her that there would be, the doll would be dismembered. I don't know how much she minded. So there was one doll with so for the Mari doll I wanted a kind of, that sort of like base model. And I love that, for a lot of them their feet like naturally end in these ridiculously small high heels. So I was looking at sort of like proto dolls, and one had she had like a very over the top kind of, maybe it's Victorian, curl, and so some of them had the wrong hair. When I was auditioning for Mother Flower, I wanted this kind of like birthing skirt womb tent, and I liked that she looked like autumn, and was maybe thinking about like Demeter and Persephone. And I think there was a dress that was the wrong colour, wrong colour. Yeah, I mean you don't really talk about the ones that didn't make the cut, but we remember them for sure.
I think we can take one more question before we explore the next project as well. Anyone has any?
I'm just curious about Plate Man. How that whole idea came about and why you needed that entity in the film.
Well, gosh, where did he come from and why was he needed? I'm trying to think where in the writing process, the dreaming process, Plate Man showed up. I mean, probably that early scene where he's formed, because I didn't necessarily dream up those scenes in order, but I think that came quite early. And I think I had an idea for a while that maybe he would be like a sort of independent figure, somehow moving, or maybe a shadow, or that, somehow I sort of wanted, whether he was the like ideal or the antagonist. Maybe I was just kind of thinking about a sort of like a triangle of who's looking where. So, if Margot is desperate for the attention of someone who's not noticing her, I mean, maybe not noticing her because he's not even there or not even real, but that's why she's kind of you could either look at it as a sort of abusive relationship, or her either in fantasy or reality staging this like very elaborate, like theatrical, I'm suffering so much, what would it take for you to notice me? And then, so that's looking that way. He's obviously, when he's mostly watching TV. And then Mari is looking to Margot. And, so I think it made sense in a kind of triangle of not being seen.
It was also very creative how it was formed.
Yeah. Did you want to ask Lana your question?
Well, just like Annie was talking about those sounds with the water, I was really intrigued by that. Like when the pearls come out of her skirt, come out of the skirt of the mother
flower, yeah.
The mother flower, there was this like watery sound, and then I think with the tongues at one point, that kind of watering, which is like, I suppose puts your mind at the unconscious, but also just thinking about what place that had for you in the film.
I guess I wanted stuff to sound, fleshy, bodily, birthy, squelchy, like this kind of proto-archaic womb-making space.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, actually, I should, one. So there were two, quotes, false Maris. So the one where she ends in high heels, because I knew, well, one got quite dirty, falling around a lot. I think I cut the clean one up, but sometimes it's just nice to give this thing away. So to like push, I'm obviously in the back pushing Mari out of the tongue sphincter. But the space behind the staircase in the dollhouse, I could get my arm that far. So then I strapped a tongue on the other Mari's face and turned her into a birth plunger. I don't think she was into that.
Those tongues are amazing. Should we move on to the third chapter?
Tongue plungers are always a great place to end. So I just wanted to introduce my next film, which is very much like under development, being written in a kind of slightly different way, ending with the Museum of the Home called The Purchase. And I guess maybe it's a moment to say a little bit about how my relationship with the Museum of the Home began. Yeah. Gaina's here. It's lovely to represent in any way. It's lovely to see you here. So I've been in touch with the Museum of the Home, formerly known as the Jeffrey, for those of you who don't know its new name, in Hoxton, since my show here, and had sort of been talking about how to, think through like my interest in the domestic, in women's stories, and how, and how like the house functions as a kind of a container, both intimate but also the social, and the political absolutely acts on it. And Sonia, the director of the museum, had said, we have some almshouses, maybe you'd like to have a look at them. This is actually the first almshouse I saw. There were two, the same footprint, one on top of the other. This one's set for the 1780s, and the one upstairs, which will show up in later images, from the 1830s. And I saw this, and you can't see it in this shot, but there's an amazing kind of witch's broom of like big twigs in the corner. And I looked at this and I thought, oh my goodness, it's kind of like Neil Jordan's, Angela Carter's Company of Wolves, it's this kind of like, feels like we're perfectly in the kind of gothic unconscious making of people world. And I'd sort of pitched, well, I hadn't really, I had another film in mind that I had in mind for years, that has like a family of 8 all not speaking. That I thought maybe was going to unfold here. But then after this look at the almshouses, I had my first visit to the collections, and the collections manager at the time, Amy, understood very quickly that I like all things strange and bodily and a bit medical and a bit unusual, and she showed me this fur-coated travelling trunk and a doll with a melted face and a lampshade that looks like it could come out of what's the one with leather face in it? Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And in the 20 minutes it took me to walk home from the museum, like I just had this idea. Actually, we will go to the next slide. It's a bit of text. You're going to read along with me. That it's going to be like 3 generations of mother and daughter in the same one-room dwelling. The daughter in each generation is going to be bedridden. You know, there'll be a kind of dynamic of, well, we'll call it care, but like, you know, there's a kind of question around, you know, what's care, whose agency, who's in a dominant position, whether we're dealing with a daughter who's actually ill, but the focus is going to be on the daughter's feet. You know, kind of got this like metaphor for like agency development, movement, and actually it's something you said that we've been talking about before, when I've been thinking about the end of the last film, and I sort of looked at Mari, and I'd been thinking about her as this kind of container for a set of feelings or memories or something that didn't belong to her. And so in this work, you know, I'm thinking about kind of quite clearly how this dynamic might be revealed or played out, that, you know, yeah, I mean, anecdotally, I'm sure we've had those moments, or even when you're talking about the super ego, those moments where you catch yourself saying something. It could be out loud, it could be in your head, but it's like, it's one of your parents' voices. But then if you're like, you know, a bit more forgiving of your parents, you might be like, it might not actually be their voice. This might be a voice that's come from like, you know, somewhere else quite a long time ago. So I'm really interested in thinking about like this kind of, this sort of dysfunctional dynamic that can be transmitted and transformed. So we're going to watch as a daughter becomes a mother, and I'm playing with this sort of name, you know, Ellie, Liza, Beth, and Elizabeth. So we can be thinking about like fragments into integration, and I'm very lucky the Museum of the Home is giving me their almshouses and full access to their collections to, you know, build this project. And we can go on to the next slide. And
yeah, I mean, just thinking of the almshouses and the last work as well, I think there's something interesting in that you often do hark back in a way to sort of interior, even the dolls. There's a sense that feels like they don't quite come from now.
Yeah.
And I wondered if you want the work to feel timeless, or if you do want it to have that sort of antique or slightly forgotten feeling. I suppose it makes me think of objects that have been forgotten, or toys that have been forgotten, that maybe aren't open anymore, or spaces that aren't inhabited anymore.
Yeah, and I tend to feel that my work more often feels maybe haunted by a kind of 1950s vibe. And I think there was a brief moment where I played with like something that would feel much more explicitly period, that could have been something like 80s, 50s, 30s, but that's not going to happen. But it, you know, I think, you know, this is going to be like, in theory, the luxury of like working with a crew for the first time, and some post-production people, and, you know, who aren't me, to maybe think about like grading the generations a bit differently. So, you know, I mean, no one's going to show up in like jeans and a t-shirt in this work, but it's not, the objects might end up sort of suggesting their own histories, and are probably also depending on how well anyone recognizes something. They can maybe pin a date on it, but I guess I'm also, I mean, I assume this is how people live. You know, I live in a rental, so like, you know, my furniture's only really haunted by IKEA. Like, But this kind of idea that, and this is, I think, one of the funny things about like going to a sort of, even the rooms through time in the museum or the sort of the National Trust vibe, where they kind of show you everything from one period, but you might live in a place where it's like it's your grandmother's chair and it's like your aunt's teapot, and these objects, they stand for different moments, different generations, but also like are the ghosts of different people, and I think that's going to show up in the work.
And with this piece, so obviously as we have here, kind of each of the women respond very differently to the situation they're in. I wondered how you sort of planned that out and how they're going to interact with one another as well.
Sure, so we've kind of got, I'll sort of go through this in the next slide. So we've got like kind of 3 generations of caregiving mothers, each with a different approach, and to oversimplify, this is probably, let's say probably, let's not pretend I've written this yet, probably, Ellie will be correcting Liza kind of very much into a sort of a mould of like conventional normative femininity. Liza will be treating Beth like she's an invalid, overprotecting her, and Beth will be neglecting Elizabeth more through ambivalence than negligence. But I really want to say in this slide, in the whole history of everything, it's very easy to blame mothers all the time for everything that went wrong ever. And I don't want to do that with this work, and I think for each of those dynamics, I kind of want to show where that behaviour might have come from and what this kind of idea of like, doing your best or doing your best with what you have come from, or also, if we actually go to the next slide please, Nick, also just like the slipperiness for both parts of that dynamic, like what it means once you've got the stamp of the mother on your head, which like Margot was struggling with for most of this film, or like, because if you could think in some ways of Mother Flower as kind of like Marie's ultimate fantasy for the mother that she wants, but Mother Flower is like, is a story, she's a door, she's a portal, like she's completely empty, she doesn't even have another body, So what it means for like both sides to kind of grapple with having an identity that both works within that relation and its distinct forces, whether they're conforming or resisting, or ultimately, perhaps finding their own kind of integration and autonomy. Next slide, please. And then I just wanted to introduce like some of the objects from the museum I've been thinking about. Also, just to say this is a sort of a portfolio of research images that I shot with Manuel Gaston that you can see downstairs, but I am not going to be appearing in this work. I think for for those who know my work, or those that don't, I am normally the performing body when it's not dolls. But I'm interested in as well looking at other trained bodies. But so we've kind of got this theme, I guess, of working with a vocabulary of objects and kind of subverting their use, has been common to my practice for quite a while. So I'd enjoyed pulling objects out of the archive and thinking about how they might be used in completely different ways. So we've got a lot of these will be like sort of measuring and correcting tools. Next slide, please. And then looking at all of these things that could be possibly used as a kind of medical intervention. This is a real vitilator from the 1930s, which when it functions makes a kind of purple electricity in it that you then zap yourself with for your health. YouTube has some great videos of like those kinds of eccentric men fixing it and showing it how it works. Next slide, please. And then we've kind of got this third generation of one who's ambivalent and one who's sort of enmeshed with the ambivalent parent, and again they're trying to find their own identities separate from each other. Next slide, please. And then there's more just play with the collections. running through it, and I sort of find myself being like, I have to stab her up the legs, and I'm going to move her around like this. I'm like, okay, legs are coming through, and legs are coming in, and then I found these in the museum's collection. So we've got this kind of idea of measurement in the first generation. Next slide, please. Sort of medical manipulation and intervention in the next generation. Next slide, please. Next. And then, this kind of like ambivalence or self-obsession or sort of fending for self in the next generation. Next slide, please. And the bedridden daughter will be silent. And I think you might have asked this a moment ago about kind of animation and where this is going. I haven't quite given up wanting to play with objects and to animate them. So we'll see how this works. But the bedridden daughter is going to kind of use a vocabulary of doll's house furniture to either try to communicate her desires or to impact reality or to resist what's happening around her. Next slide, please. And then this is just a bit of insight into how I use the museum's collection, and actually wonderful collections. Annual assistant manager Abigail says she brought me these hat pins, and she said, I hadn't found them, and she said, Katharine, I was just putting some stuff away and I found these hat pins, and I instantly thought about stabbing, and I thought about you. And I was like, excellent.
I think it's really interesting how these kind of quite delicate, beautiful objects all look really sadistic in this presentation. You sort of feel like you can attach all of these purposes to them, which, most of them weren't created for violence.
Yeah.
But, it does feel like, sort of through looking at your work, I can imagine how these could be used.
Yeah, so we go to the next one. So again, this is the beauty set, which you already saw sort of like the hooks onto, like, I think the tongs are on the eyes and the tongue downstairs, the hooks are on the face. So just this kind of idea of where I'll be taking the objects, and then thinking about, I sort of have this whole matrix of like the main thrust of each dynamic is this. How will these objects play into that? Next slide, please. And again, this is me thinking about the vitilator in the different scenes, whether they're used for perfecting or testing or shaping. Next slide, please. And then this is a little insight into how I work on site. So I was thinking in the way that I'm thinking about these, like the doll's house furniture, as the daughter's way of speaking. I found these little chairs, and I thought this could be an interesting way of playing with their dynamics. So I just started playing with like the power relationship between two chairs. It's just some mobile phone shots on site while I, to come back to. Next slide, please. And this is some of the stuff I've been reading and thinking through. In terms of, again, like how bodies are made, illness, and family dynamics. So the first text I read, which actually I already had, I was already reading it when I was visiting you last summer. This has been brewing a while, A Sanity, Madness, and the Family. It's a wild and wonderful book. It's like 11 case studies of girls, young women who've been institutionalized with schizophrenia. Lang and Esterson argue that schizophrenia is not even a valid diagnosis, but also if you were to look at this quote, sort of abnormal behavior within the patient, for want of a better word, family system, it might make sense, you know, of a kind of like a normalizing or a surviving behavior for like some strange conditions. So that was one of the first places I started really pulling out kind of ideas of family dynamics and how they might manifest. I mean, they look much more in conversation and kind of annotate conversation for like what's being said, what's not being said. They don't use the word gaslighting, I guess, because it's not maybe a psychological term, but it's rife with gaslighting.
There's lots of therapists and gaslighters as well.
Wonderful. And then I just started reading mother-daughter stories. So the juniper tree kind of, well, Cummings, the juniper tree kind of reimagines the stepmother in a really surprising way. Hot Milk plays with a mother-daughter dynamic where like the mother is ill or maybe ill. Massive kind of plays of like power and agency, where You End and I Begin is an enmeshed mother-daughter relationship with a very ambivalent, narcissistic mother. So I kind of had a sort of, I guess just a hunch about how each generation might behave, and sort of was like, well, if you were ill as a child and were ignored in being ill, and then you grew up and had a child, maybe you project the illness that was never noticed in you onto them, which is, you know, sort of like guesswork. I mean, at one point I think I thought about sending this to someone, you know, with a kind of training that I don't have, to be like, does this ring true
I
as
think
a
there's definitely this
dynamic?
idea of sort of compensation between generations as well, which then, so often you might do the thing that didn't happen for you, and then your children don't like that, so they're going to do the opposite, and it kind of flips.
Yeah. I might kind of stop here. Let's be quiet. Yeah.
One last question.
Sure.
Practically, I suppose, where are you at with this at the moment?
Yeah.
Do you need anything else to make it happen?
Excellent questions. So I've got some funding already. Obviously, I've got a lot of support from the Museum of the Home in terms of like, you know, helping, you know, make this happen. I'm waiting to hear about a large bit of funding from Film London, and then, you know, I'm definitely looking for support to help get the rest done. And I think to the end of this year will probably be me trying to work out that kind of funding and the budget and the scale. You know, it's quite a new thing for me, because it feels like to have a team involved in it, I'm gonna have to have it written in a way that's much clearer than, you know, I think I start my work with a lot of kind of like internal knowing, and I just let it happen, but this feels like there needs to be a lot of telling other people what's going to happen and us working out together how it's going to happen. So I think the next months are going to be me working that out, and also working out who's going to support the project.
And were there any final questions?
Oh, yeah, Donna?
Alice in the reference, I just noticed Alice in Wonderland.
Yeah.
Dress.
Yeah.
Sarah, Alice in Wonderland kind of theme that comes through.
Yeah, well, actually, you know, name check the things you saw. So when I was 18 and I just moved to the UK and I just moved to London, I saw a performance at Hoxton Hall called Still Falling, and every so often I look up this company. They no longer exist. I don't know, you know, what they did, but they made a performance piece that combined Alice in Bed with Alice in Wonderland and the photography of Francesca Woodman, and it was, you know, it was just like, man, my 18-year-old mind was blown. So I kind of, you know, some bits of material like that marinate for a long time. I think I bought the play, I don't know, maybe like 10 years ago, and put it on a shelf, you know, when I was ready for it, and I read that one couple of months ago, and it sort of deals with the kind of, you know, the limited options for really bright women who didn't want to marry. One of them seemed to be go to bed and die, which Alice James did.
Before I ask the question, is she a photographer, Susan Sontag?
So Susan Sontag's, I guess, kind of critical theorist, thinker.
Yeah, she wrote quite a lot of stuff. She did, yeah. I have a feeling I read something about it. But my question really was like, how do you manage this not pressure that it's going to happen and stuff? How do you manage that you remain creative and not worry about the challenges that you're kind of facing?
I mean, I really like the way that you're assuming that I just am. I mean, I guess at the moment the external pressure doesn't quite feel real yet either, you know, and maybe it's almost, I'm still in a bit of a luxury moment of limbo where a sort of working day is like I'm currently reading Jacqueline Rowe's Mothers, and then I might stop, and I've kind of got like that many pages of notes of scenes, so I might have to be like, what have I actually been thinking about? But I guess it's just like the ideas keep coming, and I try not to stop those or limit those, and I think that's going to be kind of interesting, because when I was shooting the 2 Doll's House films, or any of the previous videos I've made, it's just me performing with a camera, you know, every so often I might have oh my goodness, what are people going to think of me when they see this? And then I was like, never mind, just carry on, maybe no one's going to see it anyway. So, and I think that maybe that kind of, I don't know, trying to stay honest, for want of a better word, and being like, hello room full of people, this is how strange things are going to get, is going to be, yeah, new and maybe challenging.